trying to champion clean air on behalf of the public. So topics are going to be, I'll define the Clean Air Act, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and CASAC, the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. I'll go over the NAAQS review process. Then I'll dig into a couple of CASAC reviews. The big ones are particulate matter and ozone. And then the last thing that we did when I was chair was some unsolicited advice. And then I'll end with a couple of comments about what lies ahead. So the Clean Air Act is a federal air quality law, as I'm sure many of you know. I think it's the most influential modern federal environmental law. It was first passed in 1963, although it's mostly cited as being the 1970 Clean Air Act. And there were major amendments in 1977 and 1990. And it has a mix of general and detailed statutes, and there's extensive regulations that EPA is supposed to develop. And I'm going to focus on the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which is one of its major regulatory programs, but there's several others that are indicated on this slide. And one of the other things is that the Clean Air Act does a lot of different things. It's really voluminous. And some of the areas are very detailed and specific, and much more, some are much more general. Hello. Here we go. Wait a minute, skipped a slide. So there are a lot of other really important major environmental laws, and I list them on this slide. And I just note that most of them were passed after the Clean Air Act. And together they really help protect us and the environment. One of the things about the Clean Air Act that I think is really unique is that EPA is not allowed to consider costs in implementing setting the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And I think that makes the Clean Air Act incredibly powerful. And this has been held up over time, as is indicated on this slide. In the EPA gets sued all the time, and so these decisions were the couple of the lawsuits that indicated those decisions are on this slide. So the Clean Air Act, Section 7408, I call it the criteria air pollutant section, but it actually is listed as the National Ambient Air Quality Standards and air pollutant lists. And I want you to, this is the main part that I have been involved in my role in the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. And that's because it addresses the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And it is supposed to publish and from time to time revise a list of air pollutants that cause or contribute to air pollution, which may be reasonably anticipated to endanger public health or welfare, and the presence of which in the ambient air results from numerous or diverse mobile or stationary sources. And these criteria shall accurately reflect the latest scientific knowledge. One of the things that I want you to notice is that the list is not in the Clean Air Act. And I highlighted the criteria air pollutants in the title because that's what they're called now, even though that wording is also not in the law. And the list is supposed to be published and from time to time revised. And this is something that I tried to work on as CASAC chair, but didn't make any progress on. And we can come back to that maybe in the question and answer period if you are interested. So the primary and secondary standards are, the primary standard is to address public health, and the secondary standard is to protect public welfare. And one of the important aspects of the primary standard is supposed to be set such that there is an adequate margin of safety requisite to protect public health. So it's that margin of safety is intended to address uncertainties and to provide a reasonable degree of protection, but it doesn't require zero risk. And this interpretation has been reviewed and held up in numerous court cases. And I won't talk much more today about the secondary standard, but that's for everything else in terms of public welfare. So it could include ecological impact, reduced plant growth, reduction in visibility, and so on. So what are the National Ambient Air Quality Standards? Well, there's 6 criteria air pollutants and those are listed on the slide. And for each of them, there are 4 elements. The indicator, so we often think, and interesting, I was just looking at the EPA website today, the indicator is often what's referred to as the criteria air pollutant. For instance, the indicator for ozone and related photochemical oxidants is only ozone, and similarly for oxides of nitrogen, it's NO2. And so the EPA webpage actually lists the indicators, not the actual criteria air pollutants. Then there's the level, the averaging time, and the form. And as I said, these have been fixed for years, even though they actually decades, even though the law does not fix them. Another thing to, and then the 4 elements interact with each other, particularly the level and the form. So it can be interesting to think about how if one changes, for instance, the form, that would affect the level that would be protective. Another thing to realize is that for some of the criteria air pollutants, such as carbon monoxide, the standard's been met for a long time, that one since 2010. And all counties also meet the NO2 standard, and relatively few don't meet the SO2, lead, and PM standards. And in contrast, 209 counties are out of attainment for the current ozone standard. So the Clean Air Act has been enormously successful. This figure, pulled from the National Bureau of Economic Research publication, shows how all the criteria air pollutant levels have decreased over the past nearly 4 decades, many cut more than in half, while the the gross domestic product has tripled over the same time period. One of its strengths, the Clean Air Act explicitly calls for an independent scientific review panel. It's to have 7 members and 3 positions are named. It also lays out the tasks for the CASAC, Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. Some are supposed to be completed on a 5-year review cycle, which in practice is not met. The CASAC has not been called upon to address several of the items in its mandate, particularly advising on the social, economic, and energy effects of the NAAQS attainment. In order to meet this mandate, different experts would actually need to be involved. But the limitations of the CASAC as required by law is that the science is so large and so complex and multifaceted that it's really impossible for any 7 experts, no matter how good and well-versed they are, to do the reviews that are needed. And so what has been common practice, except with the exception of during the Trump administration at the end of the last decade, was to augment CASAC with a panel of around a dozen additional experts to ensure there's adequate breadth, depth, and overlap of expertise in this CASAC scientific reviews. And I list some of the areas of technical expertise that are often augmented on those panels. As an aside, there are federal rules that govern advisory panel members. We are special government employees, or SGEs, as is Elon Musk. And there are important rules that govern our service, as is noted on this slide. So, and there are quite a few ethics rules that we have to review and adhere to. Further, CASAC as a federal committee is subject to the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA. This slide notes the key FACA rules that CASAC must follow. It also notes that CASAC sends its communication to the EPA administrator. So some of the FACA requirements are that there needs to be public notice of meetings, they're held in public, the deliberations are in public, which means that if we're going to iterate on drafts, for instance, we can only have less than half the committee communicating outside of the public view, and there needs to be public comment as well. All right, this next slide, just for perspective, I share the various roles that I have had on CASAC panels, as a chartered CASAC member and as chair. The pattern in the Trump administration is that they dismiss standing committees. So that's what happened in 2018 and what just happened earlier this year. They also put in place new rules about who could serve on EPA committees and panels, and among them that no scientist with EPA funding was allowed to serve, as they viewed this as a conflict of interest. And working with Protect Democracy, I was party to a lawsuit against then EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, objecting to the purging of EPA advisory committees based on being a recipient of an EPA grant. So now I'll cover the work that's done by the CASAC. Most of our work, with a few exceptions, is in response to requests from EPA. This consists of reviewing documents prepared by EPA staff. So these are the integrated review plan, which lays out the upcoming review process, the integrated science assessment, which is a comprehensive review of the science and has many different aspects from atmospheric sources, exposure, health evidence, and ecological and welfare evidence. Then there's also a risk and exposure assessment. There's one for health and there's one for welfare, and there's a policy assessment, which addresses the legislative requirements and the review history, air quality and trends, and considers in the context of the primary and also the secondary standard, the decision framework, in the primary standard, the health effects evidence, the exposure and risk information, the key considerations, what are the policy relevant questions that need to be addressed, and what are the key uncertainties in area for research. So this is EPA's figure of the NAAQS review process. Note that the CASAC is involved in reviewing all 4 documents, but it is not involved in all the steps after the documents are complete. So when it goes to the agency decision-making and the interagency review and all that, there's additional public comment opportunities, but the CASAC is not involved in any of that. So now I'm going to dig into a few criteria air pollutants. Ozone and PM are the big ones, and so I'll talk about what happened with each of these. So for PM, I show the 3 most recent reviews, which were completed in 2012, 2020, and 2022. Note the shift from 2012, where there were multiple drafts of the ISA, the health risk and exposure assessment, and the policy assessment, versus in 2020, when there was only a single draft of each, and the risk and exposure assessment was folded into the policy assessment. Another difference is who did the reviews. So in 2012, and at the beginning of the review that was completed in 2020, as well as the reconsideration that happened in 2022, it was CASAC augmented with ad hoc panelists. But then during the Trump administration, the PM review was reviewed only by the chartered CASAC. And in addition, and in response to that, there was also an independent review by CASAC PM panelists that were fired by EPA, the independent particulate matter review panel. And So Chris Frey, former CASAC chair, convened and chaired the independent PM review panel. Our expenses were covered by the Union of Concerned Scientists. And we conducted the review as though we were the CASAC, followed the same ethics rules and provided a report in a similar format to what is current, what had been the common practice. And our advice was the current suite of primary PM 2.5 standards were inadequate to protect public health, and we recommended lower annual and 24-hour standards, and that the unacceptable process changes should be corrected. Another follow-up from that time period was due to the fact that Tony Cox, then CASAC chair, and an industry consultant, he was chair during the last Trump administration. He insisted that all individual studies used by EPA in its NAAQS reviews be causal. EPA uses a weight of evidence approach to the combined set of studies that inform the standard and does not discard individual studies if they don't pass a causality test. So the National Academy of Sciences and Medicine committee was convened to address how EPA reaches causal conclusions and to provide expert advice on the process. And so they concluded that the EPA's causal framework is effective, reliable, and scientifically defensible. If key scientific questions are identified, and that if a range of necessary expertise is engaged, and that there should be some improvements, namely transparency on how EPA integrates its evidence and guidance in the framework for evaluating evidence in vulnerable groups. So the outcome of our reconsideration was that we got a new final review rule for particulate matter. So this was a big success when I was chair of the Charter CASAC. The new annual standard was lowered down to 9 micrograms per cubic meter from 12. There were no changes to the 24-hour or daily standard or the secondary standards or the PM10 standards. The CASAC did recommend lowering the daily standard, but that change was not made. In addition, they revised the air quality index to improve public communication, and I showed that on this slide, and made changes to the monitoring network to protect overburdened communities. And so, so the changes had to do with the breakpoints because of the new annual standard, and also there were some changes at the high end of the range. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk about ozone, National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which is a much longer and more troubled history in the context of CASAC's advice. Back in 1997, the ozone standard for an 8-hour average was 0.08 ppm, which because of rounding was effectively 84 ppb. In the review completed in 2007, EPA recommended a range below 80 ppb to 60, while let's see, while the CASAC recommended a range between 60 and 70 ppb, and you see that in the different colors on this slide. EPA lowered the standard to 75 ppb, which angered the then CASAC, and that led to reconsideration advice by CASAC in 2010 and 2011, where both times CASAC reaffirmed its previous advice. Then the review that was completed in 2014, EPA and the CASAC had fairly similar ranges, though the CASAC excluded 70 ppb from its range. In the rushed review in 2019, the EPA recommended the standard not be changed, and the then CASAC, under Tony Cox's leadership, concurred with a minority disagreeing. Then when I was chair of CASAC, we conducted the reconsideration, and EPA didn't change its recommendation from the 2019 policy assessment, but the CASAC recommended an even lower range. And so There were in both cases, both in the rushed 2019 review as well as in our 2023 reconsideration, there were minority opinions that were distinct from the recommendation of the rest of the panel. So, like with the pre-2019 PM reviews, I'm also showing here the 3 most recent ozone reviews. In the 2014 ozone review, considered multiple drafts of the integrated science assessment, the health risk and exposure assessment, as well as the PA, the policy assessment. The review completed in 2020 was rushed by the Trump EPA nominally to stick with the 5-year review schedule noted in the Clean Air Act. The EPA staff had very little time to create the documents required for the review, and they took multiple shortcuts. Included were that they did not consider any epidemiologic studies outside of North America. They dropped doing a risk analysis based on epidemiologic studies. Thus, Michael Regan, under the Biden administration, decided to do a reconsideration of ozone. I don't think this was a popular idea with EPA staff, though with the firewall between the scientific advisory committees and EPA staff, I haven't had the opportunity to check this with them. A new ozone panel was formed for this review, and they gave us a reconsideration. The EPA gave us a reconsideration policy assessment in spring of 2022. Other than the 2 members who were held over from the previous CASAC, none of the other members had reviewed the science covered in the integrated science assessment. Thus, we had to pause to figure out how to navigate this challenging situation. How do we as scientists consider EPA's policy recommendations without having a full and deep consideration of the science? Thus, we reviewed in 2019 the final integrated science assessment in the fall of 2022 before considering a second version of the reconsideration policy assessment in 2023. Unfortunately, our advice to the EPA was not strongly enough worded, so some of the more important changes that were needed in the revised policy assessment were not incorporated into the second version. In particular, there was still no risk or exposure assessment analyses of epi studies included, and the risk and exposure analyses that were done had some important limitations and were done through the lens of EPA's recommendation that the current standards be retained. In the end, all but one of us recommended a much lower range for a new standard, and the remaining member believed that the evidence considerations alone were insufficient to make this recommendation. And since the EPA had not done the risk and exposure analyses needed to support the range recommended by the CASAC, he did not concur with their advice. And then I also wanted to highlight that during the rush review that was completed in 2020, both the integrated science assessment and policy assessment were reviewed together and only by the chartered CASAC without any additional panelists. But those drafts were prepared at the same time. So typically the policy assessment benefits from at least CASAC's advice on the integrated science assessment, and that was not possible in that review either. And then, as I mentioned, we had not reviewed an integrated science assessment, and so the process was kind of messed up because it was very difficult to give advice straight from a policy assessment. So the result was that the ozone reconsideration was canceled, and as EPA Administrator Michael Regan said, in the end, while extremely disappointed with this outcome, I decided the EPA didn't have a choice in reaching this conclusion. As a reconsideration review is unlikely that a decision to lower the standard based on CASAC's advice would have had it's unlikely that a decision to lower the standard based on CASAC's advice would have had strong court challenge, and they may have lost. The EPA did say they would move swiftly to conduct a new review, but as you can see by the recently published schedule, which is on this slide, the planned schedule is anything but swift. One consolation is that the review won't be complete until after the Trump administration is scheduled to end. My frustration with the ozone review process in general led me to push for the CASAC providing unsolicited advice on the review process, which I'll cover next. Yeah. So this figure shows, this has been in policy assessments since 2006, maybe even earlier. I haven't dug back through enough of them to know when it first showed up. But this is EPA's approach to decision for the primary standard. They look at the adequacy of the current standard, they look at the evidence and the exposure and risk-based considerations, and together they ask the question, does the available information call into question the adequacy of the current standard? This is a yes/no decision. If it's no, then they consider retaining the current standard, and if it's yes, then they consider alternative standards. Yeah. So because they only consider alternative standards when the answer is yes, we get into situations like we've had with ozone, where the CASAC is recommending much lower levels than what the EPA has concluded. And because of this decision framework, it's given the EPA license to not really adequately consider those levels. And they didn't do so in the 2020 or the subsequent reconsideration reviews. So this led us to provide the unsolicited advice to EPA in the spring of 2024. And our unsolicited advice was that we think that EPA should provide a sufficient set of alternative standards to review, even when the EPA recommends that the current standard should be retained. And there need to be risk and exposure assessments where the more protective levels recommended by CASAC are considered, and that flow chart needs to be fixed. We also asked for a second draft of the policy assessment whenever we've advised that it's needed. And frankly, we have advised when I was chair multiple times for a second draft and have never gotten one since in recent history. And then finally, while reconsiderations are presumably out of the ordinary, we need a briefing on the process in advance so that hopefully we can prevent the challenges we had with the ozone reconsideration, where we were not, did not feel qualified to advise on the policy without having considered the science. You know, because the EPA and the CASAC have had different perspectives on acceptable standards, and the single draft policy that has been put forward in recent history, there's really no opportunity to iterate, and this really amplifies the problem with that flow chart when there's no opportunity for iteration and no second draft of the policy assessment, because our perspectives just don't end up aligning. So where are we now? We've reached the current moment, and as of January 21st, 2025, this is the CASAC web pages. The chartered CASAC and all ad hoc panels have been disbanded. And to see where this may be going, I think it's helpful to review the 32 pages on the EPA in Chapter 13 of Project 2025. And 32 pages, I've condensed it down here to just a few aspects that I wanted to focus on, and group them under a couple of headings: reorganizing and refocusing, reconfiguring scientific advisory activities, and transparent and accountable science. I'm not going to read all of these. I'll put them back up during the question and answer time so you can look at them yourself. but I'll note a few things. One is the requirement is that in here is for Congress to set standards, suspending advisory bodies to ensure so-called independence under the presumption that scientists who have served were picked for their political positions rather than their scientific expertise. I also note that under Project 2025, the National Academy of Sciences is not considered independent. And finally, a number of initiatives we saw during Trump's first term are back, including the ideas about science being transparent and reproducible, and to make data available to the public, which may seem okay on the surface until you realize the underlying intent and the ways the evidence can be manipulated to achieve a desired end. So meanwhile, legal actions are moving through the courts, and this latest action suggests there may be an effort to roll back the latest PM 2.5 standards. This was reported in late February, and suggests that the current EPA is looking to do that. And then I gave this talk at the end of February to my department. And since then, I just wanted to highlight just with one article from the New York Times that the challenges continue. This one, as well as the firing of and moving around of employees, suggests that there will be a lot more to come as we move forward. So that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to take questions, and I will put the Project 2025 slide up while I see what kind of questions there are.
Thank you so much. Dr. Sheppard, we did have a question come in directly to me while you were talking, so I'll go ahead and read that one. And then we'll go to Susan Court, who I saw just raise her hand. This first question says, in your opinion and experience, can EPA legally roll back one of the NAAQS?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and I think that's what this, I'll put it back up. I think that's what they're trying to do. So typically as soon as there's a new standard, whatever it is, EPA gets sued. I think that's routine. And my sense with this this news report and what's happening now is while EPA was fighting the lawsuit against the new PM standard, they may not be fighting it anymore. And so what will play out in court, I'm not sure because I'm not enough of a legal expert, but that presumably is where the rollback would happen, would be through court action.
Thank you. Susan, I saw that you had raised your hand earlier. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Thanks. Thanks, Lianne. It's really nice to see you. I wonder, I'm still really confused by what happened with the recent reconsideration of the ozone standard. In the sort of flow chart of decision making, if the CASAC opinion was that the current standard, that there was data to suggest the current standard was not adequately protective, how is it that that juncture in the decision-making process gets bypassed by EPA? Like, I don't really get, like, it seems like this real cognitive dissonance. The EPA decides there's nothing wrong with the current standard. The CASAC decides there is. I mean, what's the purpose of this decision-making tree if it's not informed by science?
Well, I mean, EPA's review of the science led them to a no. CASAC concluded a yes, but EPA had done the work under no. And so the document they prepared didn't really address all of these things down here as thoroughly as one would want. And so one of the things that with our unsolicited advice was to you know, ask that that if they conclude, you know, the standard should be retained, they still need to pay attention to the fact that we've advised in the past that a lower standard is needed, and they should therefore do the work that had they answered yes on this slide, they should do this work anyway. Whereas right now with the flow chart, they conclude, no, they're pretty much done, right? They don't have to address alternative standards. Does that answer your question?
I guess, but I guess I thought part of their, maybe I'm not understanding the order of operations, you know, that part of it, the conclusion of yes or no is in part informed by the CASAC's interpretation of the ISA, no?
Yes, and the CASAC and the EPA, yeah, that comes together. And so in the policy assessment, those evidence-based considerations that are brought forward from the integrated science assessment are part of the policy assessment. But how policy assessment gets written and how the weight gets put on those aspects could differ between what the EPA staff conclude and what the CASAC concludes.
Yeah, it's just really, it's a very strange kind of disconnect. I mean, do you think the Biden administration, I guess this wasn't in Trump, it was in Biden. Do you think they were afraid of bad press? I guess I just wonder what would have motivated the EPA staff to be so conservative, I guess. In their health
I'm not sure how much I could speculate on that,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it would have been a lot of work to have revised. I think the reconsideration policy assessment was not really that different than it had been
Yeah.
during the previous review that was completed in 2020.
Yeah.
So they updated a little bit, but they didn't update it much. And the second version wasn't really updated that much either, because we didn't say you have to do this and you have to do that, which we should have done. I think we were a little more trusting that they would listen to us. Suggestions as opposed to our recommendations, but a lesson learned.
So going forward, how do you recommend that scientists have agency in the control of, or not the control, but have input and agency?
Well, you know, I mean, my opinion is that the process was politicized considerably during the Trump administration, and remains to be seen. But given Project 2025, it looks to me like it's headed that way again. So it's hard to know how we can engage through the process when that happens, but we've got to do our best. I mean, during the last time we had our independent particulate matter review panel, so that was one way we had agency and addressed things. But that takes a big effort on the side for people to step up.
Thanks. This was a great presentation.
Thanks.
We have another question that came through in the chat. This is from Hanjong Kim at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And this question is, what would you advise early career scientists / teachers in academia to do in order to advocate for these activities? For example, what do you recommend for epidemiologists, biostatisticians, and exposure scientists?
Well, do the best science you can, because things will come around again and it will be needed. I would think that's one really important thing, is continue to do the great work that we all do. And because this, for policy reasons, it is important, and it does make a difference in standard setting. So keep contributing to the science.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions? Yes, Douglas. You can go ahead and unmute yourself. Or put your question in the chat.
There we go. And I was wondering, going back to the independent review panel, what do you think the impact of that was on the decision-making process? And I mean, was it really having any real contribution in terms of changing the policies?
Well, I do think that at least some of the chartered CASAC members found that that advice was incredibly valuable because they couldn't rely on the breadth and the depth of a large panel. And so they basically, read our report and use that to help them develop their own opinions. So to the degree that there's somebody on chartered CASAC that's open to that kind of input, then I think it can be incredibly valuable. But in the end, the recommendations are based on those seven people that are on the chartered CASAC, and it's their advice that goes to the administrator and moves things forward.
But it was a very unique situation in that the members had been impaneled previously.
Yes.
And so thinking forward under the current administration, whether there's an opportunity or a structure that could be reproduced in some sense. I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
we operated under the auspices of the Union for Concerned Scientists, and could they maybe impanel a group of experts, and would they have any, I guess, CASAC does welcome theoretically comments from any outside group.
Yes, and I didn't highlight this when I was talking about FACA, but and I saw it in the chat too. We can always provide public comments, and so when I've been on the inside, of course, as when you're on the panel or the CASAC, you need to listen to those comments and take those into account. But when you are not on it, you can definitely step up and provide those comments. And effectively, that's what the independent review panel, PM review panel did. It was just a much more lengthy set of public comments than normal, what typically that an individual would put together. And certainly, I think groups of scientists could get together, and there were some of the reviews that did have panels already, and there was a charter CASAC that who knows how many of them maybe will be put back when they finally decide, because the nominations, I believe, are still open. Maybe somebody who's on this call knows the details, but I think they're still taking names, or they were taking names. So presumably they'll decide who's going to be on the charter CASAC. But anyway, once they start doing their reviews, we can always provide input through public comments. And if people could muster the energy that, I mean, Chris Frey put an enormous amount of work into that independent PM review panel. So that somebody to step up is an important part of this, the answer.
So comments from individual scientists or epidemiologists would be welcome, but in some sense, if it were feasible for ISEE to impanel or come together with a combined statement, clearly that would have a much stronger impact than individual members commenting. So it might be something that the society might think about taking on. But as you said, it was a huge effort that was organized in this particular case.
Yes. So yeah, I think we could volunteer to do some of that work, and how much weight it ends up getting paid attention to is hard to say in the end, but if we don't do it, then it gets no weight. So I think it is important to step up and make sure we're heard.
Well, I remember my own experience in testifying before the panel. I mean, you're given 5 minutes or something to testify, and Tony knew clearly that I was going to be challenging him and what they were saying, and very graciously, introduced me and allowed me my 5 minutes, and then thanked me, and then totally ignored everything I had to say. So, yeah, it's a tough situation.
Yeah. I mean, we can't force them to take into account what we say, but they do need to hear us.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you. Did we have any other questions? I didn't see anything come through in the chat. Well, if not, I think then let's end it there. Oh, let's see. Oh, yes. And then, of course, Priya UCSF is making a lot of public comments, and I know that they are posting a lot of those into the record. Yeah, and I think that we can end it there unless anyone has any last minute things to ask Lianne about. And again, thank you so much for your time. That I really learned a lot about everything that's going on, and yeah, a lot to think about with all the Project 2025.
Lianne,
right.
this is not a question, but I just want to say what you've done is a tremendous amount of work and a huge lift on behalf of the community. And so I think it's important to just acknowledge that and your contributions, with really deep gratitude for doing that.
Well, thank you, Julian. We all find ways to step up in ways that we can, and I think it's all value added. So I want to share that gratitude across all of the people who are here, and encourage you to continue to step up in your way too.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Bye.